This is the disturbing Great Depression iceberg. Apologies in advance for the voice quality, I'm currently battling a cold. Tier 1, Black Thursday. Imagine checking your phone on a random Thursday morning and watching your entire life savings disappear before you can finish your coffee. That's basically what happened on October 24, 1929. Except nobody had phones. So they had to stand on the trading floor and watch it happen in person. For about 8 years leading up to that day, the stock market had done nothing but go up. Everyone wanted in. And Wall Street had a trick that made it easy. It was called margin buying. Say you wanted to buy 100 shares of a hot stock, but you only had enough cash for 10. Your broker would lend you the money for the other 90. If the stock went up, you kept all the profit from 100 shares and paid back the loan like it was nothing. But if the stock dropped, you still owed the broker for those 90 shares. And suddenly, you're sitting on a mountain of debt you can't pay. Of course, people ignored that part because the market kept climbing and everybody felt invincible. By August 1929, investors owed about $8.5 billion in margin loans, which was more than all the physical cash circulating in the entire United States. To make things worse, the actual economy underneath all of this was already rotting. Factories had spent the decade overproducing cars and appliances, and regular people had racked up so much credit debt they actually stopped buying. Warehouses were full, sales were tanking, and experts started warning that a crash was coming. Nervous investors began selling their stocks early to get out while they could, and because everyone rushed for the exit at the same time, stock prices started falling fast. That brings us to Black Thursday. When the opening bell rang at 10 a.m., panic hit the floor immediately. Brokers dumped around 3 million shares in the first few minutes alone. Normally, trading that many shares took several days. Prices were in free fall, and brokers who had loaned out all that margin money started demanding it back. Most people didn't have the cash, so brokers seized their stocks and sold them off, which drove prices down even further. It became an unstoppable loop. Prices drop, brokers sell, prices drop more. By noon, the trading floor was in complete chaos. To try and get things under control, a group of Wall Street's most powerful bankers, led by Thomas Lamont from JP Morgan, held an emergency meeting and pooled $130 million of their own money. They handed it to Richard Whitney, JP Morgan's main broker, and sent him onto the floor to loudly buy stocks at high prices so everyone would calm down. The stunt worked, and the market steadied for the weekend. Then Monday came and the fear came right back. The market dropped 13% in a single day. Tuesday was worse. Investors traded a record 16 million shares trying to escape. And this time, the bankers who had saved things on Thursday looked at the numbers and decided it wasn't worth trying again. Without them propping things up, stock prices hit the floor. Millionaires who were rich at breakfast were broke by dinner, still owing millions in margin loans on stocks that were now worth almost nothing. But the crash itself wasn't what broke the country. That was the banks. Local banks across America had been quietly taking their customers' savings and investing them in the stock market. When everything collapsed, those savings vanished overnight. Over the next 3 years, panicked people rushed to pull their money out, only to find empty vaults. Banks started falling by the hundreds, and that domino effect is what tipped the country into the Great Depression, starting with the silence of idle men. Imagine waking up, putting on your best work suit, kissing your family goodbye, and heading out the front door. But you don't actually have a job to go to. You just spend the entire day wandering empty streets or hiding out in public libraries. In 1932, this was the reality for thousands of men all over New York City. They were secretly part of the 12,830,000 Americans who had lost everything. It started right after the crash, when the banks went under and took everyone's savings with them. People stopped spending money. When people stopped spending, the factories that made the things nobody was buying anymore had no reason to stay open. Manufacturing cities like Detroit and Toledo got hit first and hardest, with local unemployment shooting up to 80% almost overnight. And it spread from there. When the factories closed, minority workers were always the first ones to be let go, followed by everyone else. Millions of people suddenly had zero income, which meant they stopped shopping, which meant the local stores that depended on them went bankrupt too. With the cities broke, farmers had nobody left to sell their crops to, and over 1 million farming families lost their land. Even the wealthy weren't safe. A famous multimillionaire named Thomas Frederick Bell, known as Champagne Fred because of how lavishly he lived, lost his entire fortune in the crash, and ended up standing on a street corner in San Francisco selling apples for 5 cents just to eat. The numbers tell the full story. In 1929, about 1.5 million people were unemployed. By 1933, that had exploded to nearly 13 million with zero income. Charities tried to fill the gap, but ran dry almost immediately. Down in Atlanta, relief organizations could only scrape together $1.30 per week for an entire family. That brought a few loaves of bread and some milk to keep a family of 5 alive for 7 days. But the money was only half of it. In the 1930s, society told men their entire worth came from being a provider. When the jobs disappeared, millions of them saw it as a personal failure instead of a national crisis. That guilt is exactly why those thousands of men in New York kept putting on their suits every morning and faking a commute to a job that didn't exist. And it wasn't just the men carrying it. A writer named Meridel Lasser watched hungry women sit in government unemployment offices for hours, waiting for jobs that simply didn't exist. At home, things were even worse. In some mining towns, 90% of the children were malnourished. One little girl even told her teacher she couldn't eat lunch because it was her sister's turn to eat that day. Around 250,000 kids eventually decided they'd rather be homeless than be another mouth their parents couldn't feed. They ran away, hopped freight trains illegally, and built a whole hobo world of their own. But we'll get to that later. By the end of 1932, over 60% of the country was officially poor. Married couples even stopped getting divorced because they couldn't afford a lawyer. Husbands just walked out the front door, said they were going for milk, and never came back. Breadlines. Imagine walking down a street in New York City on a freezing morning in 1930. You turn the corner and run into a man in a thick overcoat standing in a line that stretches all the way around the block. Just 6 months after the Wall Street crash, this was already normal. With jobs gone and life savings wiped out by failed banks, millions of people suddenly couldn't afford groceries. So across the country, men lined up outside churches and storefronts just to get a bowl of soup or piece of bread to eat that day. You'd think the government set these up, but they didn't. President Herbert Hoover flat out refused to spend federal money on food. He believed that if the government started handing out free meals, Americans would get lazy, stop looking for work, and lose their independent spirit. In his mind, building character mattered more than preventing actual starvation. So he left the job of feeding millions of starving people entirely to local charities. Groups like the Salvation Army, a Christian organization famous for street preaching and helping the poor, tried to step up. But they ran on donations from everyday people, and everyday people were broke. Once the charity money dried up, the only people left with actual cash were the criminals. Down in Chicago, the most famous mob boss in America saw an opportunity. Al Capone ran the city's illegal alcohol and gambling operations. And even with the economy in ruins, desperate people were still buying bootleg booze to numb the pain. That kept his rackets pulling in somewhere between $60 and $100 million a year. With cash to spare, he opened a massive storefront right down the street from the police headquarters, offering 3 free meals a day to anyone who was out of work. Nothing says the government has failed you quite like standing in line to get dinner from Chicago's most famous criminal. For the men standing in that line, hunger came first, but the shame was right behind it. These were former bank managers, factory supervisors, and office clerks who used to be the ones handing out paychecks. Now they stood on sidewalks, waiting for a free bowl of soup, with their hats pulled low and their eyes on the pavement, hoping nobody they knew would see them there. Eventually, Hoover's plan to let local goodwill handle the crisis failed, because neighborly charities simply couldn't feed 15 million starving people. Capone's kitchen lasted barely 6 months before he shut it down in early 1931 and went to prison for tax evasion. The federal government didn't step in with real relief money until May 1933. By then, millions of people had already spent years braving extreme hunger and doing whatever they could to survive. Tier 2. Hoovervilles. Imagine waking up to find your life savings gone because your bank went under. Then your factory lets you go on the same day. Your landlord starts banging on the door for rent money you don't have, so you get thrown out onto the street. That was the reality for an unemployed lumberjack named Jesse Jackson. After getting kicked out of his home, Jesse found himself wandering around an empty, muddy shipyard in Seattle, Washington. While looking for a place to sleep on October 1931, he bumped into 19 other homeless guys who were also totally out of luck. Together, they started hammering pieces of scrap wood together just to build a tiny shelter from the rain. Because building a shack on city property is illegal, the local police showed up, poured kerosene all over their new home, and burned it to the ground. Jesse had nowhere else to go, so he just rebuilt it. The police burned it down again. So Jesse dug a hole in the concrete and built it a third time. And Jesse wasn't the only one. Thousands of desperate people across the country were doing the same thing, throwing together their own illegal scrap cities out of whatever they could find because there was simply no other option. As these camps kept popping up, a political strategist named Charles Michelson spotted an opportunity. Michelson worked for the Democratic Party and wanted to make sure voters blamed President Hoover for the mess. So he started calling the camps Hoovervilles. The name stuck immediately, and pretty soon the president's own name became a nationwide punchline for poverty. That Seattle camp Jesse started with a single shack eventually grew into a neighborhood of 1,200 broke people who had nowhere else to go. In 1934, a graduate student named Donald Francis Roy bought himself a shack for $15 just to see who was actually living there. Turns out it wasn't just drifters. Doctors, lawyers, and even bank managers were living in the mud right alongside day laborers. The Seattle camp was huge, but the largest of these scrap communities was along the river of St. Louis, Missouri. It held up to 5,000 people and ran just like a real town. A former fruit vendor named Gus Smith acted as mayor, while the residents managed a soup kitchen that fed 4,000 people a day and built their own churches out of old orange crates. Even as Hoovervilles kept spreading and making President Hoover look worse, he still wouldn't step in. He believed that printing money and handing out direct aid would trigger inflation and wreck the economy even more. So while people were building homes out of scrap wood, cardboard, and whatever else hadn't blown away, Washington's response was mostly silence. People eventually got tired of starving politely. In July 1932, around 15,000 World War I veterans marched into Washington, D.C. and set up camp, asking for the financial help they'd been promised. They were broke, unemployed, and out of patience. Instead of help, things got ugly fast. We'll get to that part in a bit. A few years later, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and finally introduced federal programs that paid unemployed men to do public work. St. Louis used one of those same programs to clear out its massive Hooverville. So yes, the government finally started paying people. But some of those jobs involved driving the bulldozers that destroyed the only homes others had left. World trade collapse. Between 1931 and 1944, government workers in Brazil shoveled over 78 million bags of perfectly good coffee beans directly into furnaces. They dumped billions of pounds of it straight into the ocean. This was happening while millions of people around the world were standing in breadlines starving. The reason they destroyed all that food was simple. Nobody on Earth had the money to buy it anymore. After the crash wiped out American savings and shut down factories, everyday Americans went broke. People don't exactly prioritize imported goods when they're busy stretching a single potato into 3 meals. So they stopped buying anything foreign. That triggered a domino effect. With no buyers, factories around the world started bleeding money. Panicked politicians figured they could protect their own businesses by slapping massive taxes on imports, forcing citizens to buy local. But when America taxed French goods, France taxed American goods right back. Then everyone else joined in. It became a global staring contest where everybody lost, and international trade dropped 65%. This giant trade freeze completely ruined countries that relied on selling one specific thing. Down in Chile, the entire economy ran on nitrates, minerals used for fertilizer and explosives. When the world stopped buying, their exports dropped 83%, and the whole economy collapsed like a Jenga tower. That collapse forced tens of thousands of workers to abandon the mining fields and flood into the cities with zero income. In Canada, wheat prices fell to 39 cents a bushel, and farmers who had taken out massive loans for equipment were suddenly stuck paying off tractors with a crop worth less than pocket change. Germany got hit especially hard. Its economy depended heavily on American loans and exports, so when both dried up, around 6 million Germans lost their jobs, and desperation spread everywhere. When people are hungry, broke, and angry, they usually stop voting for calm, reasonable people and start listening to whoever promises quick fixes. Add the bitterness from losing World War I, and it created the perfect opening for one very angry man with a toothbrush mustache to rise to power. We'll get to him properly a little later. It also set things off in Japan. Rural families survived by making raw silk and selling it to America. When Americans stopped buying luxury clothes, the silk market collapsed, and entire farming villages went bankrupt overnight. Since the civilian government couldn't fix the crisis, the Japanese military decided to fix it with force. Army officers faked an explosion on a railway track in 1931 and used it as an excuse to invade a region in China called Manchuria, just so they could steal raw materials and find new customers. That move helped push Japan further down the road towards some of the worst war crimes of this century. By 1932, the planet had fractured into angry little trade blocs that refused to do business with anyone outside their own borders. Because politicians chose to be petty instead of cooperative, over 30 million people worldwide were completely out of work. Decades later, new leaders signed treaties to make sure a trade freeze like this could never happen again. You'd think after all that, slapping giant taxes on imports would be permanently filed under things we agreed never to do again. And yet here we are, FDR's gold confiscation. Imagine it's early March 1933. It's been 4 years since Black Thursday. Over 9,000 banks have failed and wiped out more than $1 billion in life savings. Across the United States, panic crowds are pounding on the locked doors of the last surviving banks to pull their cash out before those banks collapse too. Things were so bad that 48 hours before Franklin Roosevelt took his oath as the new president in March 1933, governors across the country ordered their local banks to shut down just to stop the bleeding. When Roosevelt rode toward the Capitol for his inauguration on March 4th, the U.S. Treasury was so broke it couldn't even pay for its own workers. The American banking system was essentially a corpse. Roosevelt knew he had to kill the panic before it killed off what was left of the economy. So he planned something drastic. At one morning on Monday, March 6th, he dusted off an old wartime law and used it to freeze every single banking transaction in the country. He called it a bank holiday, which is a pretty cheerful name for the government telling you that you can't touch your own money. The freeze gave officials time to inspect every surviving bank and figure out which ones could actually reopen without immediately collapsing. A few days later, Roosevelt went on the radio and spoke directly to 60 million Americans. He explained what was happening, promised they were going to fix it, and asked people to trust the system enough to put their money back in. Most of them did, but saving the banks came with a catch nobody saw coming. On April 5th, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. Every person in America was ordered to hand over almost all of their gold to the federal government. Coins, bars, certificates, all of it. In return, the government paid $20.67 per ounce, which was the official price at the time. If you refused, you were looking at 10 years in prison or a $10,000 fine, which comes out to roughly $250,000 today. Most people trusted the president, so they handed it over. The government then moved all that gold into a brand new high-security vault called Fort Knox. And once it was safely locked away, Roosevelt raised the official price of gold to $35 an ounce. Just like that, the government pocketed a $2.8 billion profit overnight. And every loyal citizen who followed the rules lost 40% of their wealth in the process. People were furious. Lawsuits went all the way to the Supreme Court. One justice, James McReynolds, got so angry he declared the Constitution dead and compared Roosevelt to Nero, the Roman emperor famous for being terrible at his job. But the court ruled in the government's favor anyway. Despite the outrage, the government kept the gold ban completely legal and active for the next 41 years. It wasn't until New Year's Eve in 1974 that Americans were legally allowed to own gold as money again. Also, almost nobody who secretly held onto their gold ever got arrested or went to jail. So the people who trusted the government and followed the rules got robbed, and the ones who broke the law and kept their gold faced no consequences and ended up making a fortune. Tier 3. The Bonus Army. If you traveled to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1932, you'd find 43,000 people camped out in the mud across the river from the U.S. Capitol building. These were men who had fought in World War I, along with their wives and kids, all crammed into a makeshift city they hammered together out of scrap wood, because the government owed them money and wouldn't pay up. The whole thing goes back to 1924, when Congress passed a law giving every soldier a cash bonus certificate worth a few $100s to make up for the fact that they'd fought a war for $1 a day. The problem was that they couldn't actually cash it in until 1945, which was more than 20 years away. Most of them accepted it, went home, and got regular jobs. Then the Depression hit. Those jobs vanished, and that bonus became the only shot they had at keeping food on the table. With nowhere else to turn, thousands of them loaded up their families, headed straight to Washington, and set up camp on a muddy field called Camp Marks to pressure Congress into handing over the money early. For weeks, they waited while politicians debated a bill to release the money. On June 17th, the Senate voted it down. When the news hit the camp, nobody rioted. The men stood outside the Capitol, sang "America the Beautiful," and walked back to the mud. That kind of restraint should have earned them at least a conversation with the president. Instead, Hoover refused to see them and convinced himself the whole thing was a front for criminals planning to overthrow the government. On July 28th, police tried to clear a small group out of some empty buildings downtown that they'd set up camp in. The men pushed back, bricks started flying, and a panicked officer shot 2 unarmed veterans dead. When he heard about the incident, Hoover ordered the army to restore order downtown and put General Douglas MacArthur in charge, with specific instructions to leave the family camp across the river alone. MacArthur ignored him. He rolled out infantry with bayonets, cavalry on horseback, and actual tanks, and marched them straight at the protesters. They fired tear gas reportedly laced with Adamsite, a chemical that causes violent vomiting, and used it to push choking families all the way back across the river. Once the camp was empty, soldiers set the whole thing on fire. The government's decision to turn tanks on their own war heroes turned out to be a career-ending move. Footage of the burning camp showed up in theaters within days, made people furious, and the public fury practically handed the next election to Franklin Roosevelt. When Roosevelt took office and a smaller group came back asking for their money, he handled it differently. He set up a clean camp, sent his wife Eleanor out to drink coffee and sing songs with them. And in 1936, Congress finally passed a law to pay the bonus. Millions of veterans got their cash. Riding the rails. In the 1930s, a 15-year-old kid named Tiny Brolin sat down for his only meal of the day. It was a plain boiled potato. No butter, no salt, nothing. His family had run out of food, so Tiny made a decision. He hugged his mother goodbye, pawned his wristwatch for a few cents, and walked to the nearest train yard to hop onto a moving freight car. From that moment on, he was part of a massive underground world of kids riding the rails to survive. During the worst stretch of the Great Depression, around 4 million Americans abandoned their homes and took to the road. About 250,000 of them were teenagers just like Tiny. They couldn't afford tickets, so they illegally jumped onto freight trains and rode them across the country looking for any work they could find. And even living in the dirt, these travelers had rules. They actually split themselves into a strict pecking order based on pride. If you traveled and looked for work, you were a hobo. If you traveled and refused to work, you were a tramp. If you just sat in one spot and begged, you were a bum. Getting those mixed up was a good way to start a fight. The trains themselves were deadly. Slip while jumping on and the wheels would kill you. If the train stopped suddenly and a heavy freight door slammed shut, you would be locked inside with no way out. Government records show that nearly 25,000 people were killed trespassing on railroads during the 1930s. And the trains were only half the problem. Railroad companies hired guards called bulls. Their job was to keep people off the cars, and they weren't gentle about it. One of the most feared railroad guards of the era was Jeff Carr of Cheyenne. He was known for hunting down hobos with a club and showing zero mercy. It didn't matter if the victim was a grown man or a starving teenager. Because the outside world was so hostile, hobos built their own hidden camps in the woods, near the tracks, and called them jungles. Everyone who stayed in a jungle had to pitch in. They tossed whatever scraps they could find into one shared pot. A stolen potato, a wild onion, half a can of beans, pretty much anything edible. And it all became something called mulligan stew. Since hobos were always moving through towns they didn't know, they needed a way to warn each other about local dangers. So they invented a secret visual language. The stories say they used chalk to mark simple symbols on fences, sidewalks, and water towers so the next person passing through would know what to expect. One sign could mean a house offered free food, another could warn about a mean dog or a hostile homeowner. The problem is, most serious historians aren't convinced it worked that way. A sociologist named Nels Anderson, who had actually ridden the rails himself before becoming an academic, found very little evidence that hobos relied on these symbols the way people later described. Most of the famous hobo signs seem to have been exaggerated over time. What they actually relied on was much simpler. They talked to each other face to face in the jungle camps, swapping information the old fashioned way. They also scratched their first names onto the sides of freight cars as a way of telling other travelers they'd been there first. When World War II finally started, everything changed. The government drafted millions of men and opened up thousands of factory jobs. The hobo camps that had once been packed with desperate people started emptying fast, because for the first time in years, there was actual work to be found. Dance marathons. It's December 1932 inside a dusty dance hall in Somerville, Massachusetts. You're broke, you're starving, and some promoter walks up and dangles an offer in your face. A dance competition with $1,000 grand prize. In the middle of the Depression, that kind of money could feed your family for an entire year. All you gotta do is grab a partner and keep dancing. Nobody mentions that winning means shuffling your feet for 5 straight months while your brain slowly melts, and a crowd of strangers pays 25 cents a head to watch it happen. The whole thing started as a goofy stunt. Back in March 1923, a dance teacher named Alma Cummings walked into a ballroom in Upper Manhattan and decided to see how long she could waltz. 27 hours later, she destroyed her shoes and burned through 6 different male partners. The newspapers ate it up and the whole country caught the bug. Then, the economy tanked, and promoters with dollar signs in their eyes started traveling the country setting up official competitions. They promised free food and shelter to anyone who entered, which was all it took to fill the floor when a quarter of the population couldn't afford dinner. The rules were simple and cruel. Keep your feet moving for 45 minutes out of every hour. When the siren blasted, you got exactly 15 minutes to spin to a cot and collapse. The second those minutes ran out, you dragged yourself back out. Let your knees touch the ground and the judges tossed you. So contestants learned to eat sandwiches, knit, and flip through newspapers while their legs kept going underneath them. About a week in, the lack of sleep started doing real damage. Dancers would be so exhausted they could barely keep their eyes open, and then the hallucinations would hit. Some started picking invisible flowers off the floor. Others bolted across the room, running from things nobody else could see. Across different competitions, this kept happening over and over. And instead of calling a doctor, the crowds just thought it was part of the entertainment. They even had a name for it. They called it going squirrely. One competition in New York alone pulled in 12,000 spectators every single day. And all of them paid good money just to watch 91 couples gradually fall apart. Because the money was that good, organizers did whatever it took to keep people on the floor. When exhausted women wouldn't wake up from their 15-minute naps, judges jammed smelling salts under their noses. When that didn't work on the men, they threw them into tubs of ice water to shock them back onto their feet. Nobody cared if the contestants were suffering, as long as the tickets kept selling. Eventually, it stopped being just cruel and turned deadly. A guy named Homer Morehouse dropped dead from heart failure after 87 hours on the dance floor. Over in Seattle, a woman named Gladys Lenz danced for 19 days straight, took a punch to the jaw from her hallucinating partner, and walked away with just $50. She tragically tried to end her own life shortly after. You would think people would stop hosting events like this once dancers started dying, but the business only kept growing. At its peak, around 20,000 Americans were employed full-time in the industry as promoters, nurses, and judges, and that meant there was always someone getting paid to keep it going. So even when things got ugly, nobody had much incentive to shut it down. Tier 4. Mexican Repatriation. Imagine you're a 9-year-old girl named Emilia Castañeda. Your parents moved from Mexico to California years ago to work and build a life. You were born in Los Angeles, which makes you a full American citizen. Then, one day, in 1935, local officials show up and force you, your dad, and your brother onto a train. They let you bring one trunk full of clothes. Everything else stays behind, including your mother's grave. The train drops you off in Mexico, a country you've never set foot in before, and things only get worse from there. You only speak English, so the local kids bully you constantly, until you give up on school entirely and start working just to eat. Your family has no money and no land, so you spend the next 9 years homeless, moving from tent to tent with no running water. When you finally save up enough to get back to your real home at 18, the border guards look at your American birth certificate, shrug, and make you buy a tourist visa just to enter your own country. As sad as it sounds, stories like Emilia's were pretty common back in the 1910s and 1920s. At that time, America was desperate for cheap labor to build railroads, dig mines, and run farms. So the government recruited hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers to do the heavy lifting. And since nobody really cared about border paperwork back then, these families just moved north, settled down, bought houses, and started having American-born kids. Then the stock market crashed in 1929 and everything flipped. White Americans were suddenly broke and terrified, and they needed someone to blame. Understanding why Wall Street collapsed was complicated, but pointing at the Mexican family down the street was easy. So politicians and labor unions started openly accusing Mexican workers of stealing jobs that the Depression had actually destroyed. To fix the Mexican problem that never existed in the first place, local governments decided to destroy the community completely. Los Angeles is the clearest example. The city wanted to cut its welfare budget, and officials figured out it was cheaper to buy a family a one-way train ticket to Mexico than to keep paying them weekly food assistance. Buying the tickets was only one part of the plan. Getting families to comply was the other. And that's where the fear came. In 1931, armed immigration agents surrounded La Placita Park in downtown Los Angeles. They located the exits and trapped around 400 Latino residents inside for hours. People were questioned, papers were checked, and anyone who looked suspicious was taken away. Nobody actually cared about the paperwork. The whole raid was designed to make every Latino family in the area so afraid that they'd leave on their own. Once the raid softened people up, city welfare workers started knocking on doors with a simple threat. They told starving families that the city was permanently cutting off their food assistance. Stay in America and starve, or take a free train ticket to Mexico, where you can at least try to grow something. For families already growing hungry, that wasn't much of a choice. The city even went after the hospital. Workers rounded up Latino parents and lied to their faces, telling them some of their illnesses could only be treated in Mexico. Others, they just loaded into cars, drove across the border, and dumped in the dirt. The whole thing finally stopped when World War II broke out. America suddenly needed cheap labor again, and a massive military draft has a funny way of making people forget why they hated their neighbors. The same government that spent years forcing these families out turned around and started begging them to come back and pick crops. The Navajo Livestock Massacre. It's the summer of 1934 in a dusty canyon on the Navajo reservation. A Navajo woman in her 60s is standing there watching in horror as men from the U.S. government drive her entire flock of goats into a shallow dirt pit and shoot every single one of them. The agents pour kerosene over the bodies and set them on fire. To understand how devastating that was, you have to understand what those animals meant. In Navajo culture, women controlled the family's wealth, and that wealth walked on 4 legs. They raised the sheep, sheared the wool, and wove it into beautiful rugs, and sold those rugs to buy food and supplies. On top of that, their religion taught that these animals were a sacred gift from the holy people. So when the government burned a flock, they were torching a woman's bank account and her church at the same time. The reason any of this happened traces back to the Depression. The government was building a massive dam on the Colorado River, what we now call the Hoover Dam, to generate power and bring water to the desert. But while construction was underway, Washington realized they had a mud problem. Huge amounts of dirt were washing downstream toward the dam, and if enough of it piled up, it would bury the turbines and wreck the whole project. So they sent a man named John Collier to figure out where all the dirt was coming from. Collier looked at a map, saw the Navajo reservation sitting right next to the river with over 1 million sheep and goats on it, and decided those animals were the problem. His logic was that the flocks were eating too much grass, and without grass holding the soil down, the dirt was blowing straight into the water. Instead of hiring engineers to build proper barriers, Collier decided that the cheapest solution was to just kill the animals. In 1934, he sent agents into the reservation. The official plan was to force the Navajo to sell their herds and have the agents walk the animals to railroad stations for shipping. But these flocks were the only food source starving families had left, so the Navajo started hiding their sheep and goats inside remote canyons. When the agents finally tracked them down, the animals were too far out in the desert to move anywhere, so they just shot them where they stood. Over 100,000 sheep and goats were killed on the spot. By 1946, the government had wiped out half of all livestock on the reservation, and then they made it worse. To keep the herds from growing back, federal agents created a permit system controlling who was allowed to own sheep. Since the white government officials refused to deal with women, they handed every single permit to the Navajo husbands. In one move, the government stripped away the traditional wealth and authority that Navajo women had held for generations. The Philippines. Imagine you're a 22-year-old Filipino farm worker named Fermin Tobera. You came to California legally to work the fields, earn a living, and build something steady for yourself. Life has been hard, but manageable up to this point. Then one cold night in January 1930, everything changes. You're hiding in a closet in a farm worker's bunkhouse in Watsonville because a mob of about 500 white men is outside, shooting into the building. You don't make it out. Fermin's murder didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a system America had been building for decades. Back in 1898, the U.S. beat Spain in the Spanish-American War, and as part of the peace deal, America bought the Philippines for $20 million and turned the islands into a colony. Then Washington got to work making the Philippines completely dependent on the American market. They let Philippine crops into the U.S. tax, which sounds generous until you realize what it actually did. Filipino farmers stopped growing their own food and switched to sugar for export, because that's where the money was. And since they weren't producing basics anymore, they had to turn around and buy everyday goods right back from American factories. The whole setup was a loop that only worked as long as America kept buying. Since the Philippines was under U.S. control, Filipinos were classified as U.S. nationals. They couldn't vote, and they weren't full citizens, but they could travel to the mainland and work. That's how young guys like Fermin ended up picking crops in California for pennies. When the Depression hit, that whole setup turned against them. Global sugar prices crashed, and American sugar companies watched their profits drop fast. Instead of taking the loss, they pushed Washington to shut the Philippines out of the market and get rid of the competition. In 1934, Roosevelt signed a law promising the Philippines independence in 10 years. Which also conveniently gave the US an excuse to limit how much sugar the islands could sell. Since the Philippine economy depended heavily on that trade, those limits wrecked local farmers almost overnight and sent the economy straight into the ground. The same law also hit Filipinos already in America. They were reclassified as aliens, and immigration was cut to just 50 people a year. For the roughly 120,000 already there, things turned ugly fast. Jobs were scarce, and angry mobs blamed them. That tension is what led to the violence in Watsonville that killed Fermin. Instead of protecting the workers, the U.S. government offered a harsh way out. A free, one-way ticket back to the Philippines. The deal was simple. Leave now and you could never return. But back home, the economy had already been wrecked by those same U.S. trade laws, so plenty of men knew going back meant walking straight into poverty. Or worse. Faced with that choice, most stayed. In the end, only about 2,000 of 45,000 men took the offer. Puerto Rico. It's Sunday afternoon in March 1937. You're a young tailor named Bolivar Marquez Telequia, and you just joined a peaceful protest in the streets of Ponce, Puerto Rico. It should have been just another march. Instead, government police open fire on the crowd with submachine guns. A bullet tears through your chest. As you drag yourself across the pavement, bleeding and knowing you're about to die, you use your own blood to write one final message on a white wall. Long live the Republic and down with the murderers. 19 people died that afternoon, and over 200 were wounded. The American governor of the island, Blandon Winship, watched it happen and then sent a message back to Washington, claiming the unarmed marchers started the fight. This was the Ponce Massacre, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. Just like the Philippines, the US took Puerto Rico from Spain, and then let a handful of American corporations buy up most of the island's farmland. Local families lost their land and their ability to grow their own food. Instead, they got pushed into low-wage jobs growing sugar for those same companies. The entire island basically became one giant plantation that existed to make money for people who didn't live there. That setup is exactly what made the Great Depression hit Puerto Rico like a truck. In September 1928, a massive Category 5 hurricane tore through the island and wiped out nearly half of the crops. Then, exactly 4 years later, another huge hurricane hit, killed hundreds of people, and destroyed around $20 million worth of crops. Normally, farmers in a situation like that would replant, switch crops, and try to recover. Puerto Rico didn't really have that option. When most of your land is already tied up in corporate sugar plantations, you don't just decide to grow something else and hope for the best. From there, things only got worse. The corporations slashed wages to about 50 cents a day and started firing workers to protect their profits. Since they controlled the whole economy, that one decision triggered mass unemployment across the island. By 1934, most of Puerto Rico had no work. The American government did eventually step in, but not in a way that actually helped. Roosevelt created minimum wage protections and Social Security for workers on the mainland, then specifically excluded farm workers from both. And since most of Puerto Rico's workforce was farming, almost nobody on the island qualified for anything. That's what pushed people into the streets. A local leader named Pedro Albizu Campos, who was Harvard educated and fed up with watching his country get squeezed dry, organized massive protests demanding independence. The response to these protests is the scene you saw at the beginning. Submachine guns, 19 dead, and a governor who lied about all of it. Tier 5. Eugenics Movement. On October 19, 1927, a 21-year-old woman named Carrie Buck was dragged into an operating room in Virginia. In that room, doctors permanently removed her ability to have children, and they did it with the full blessing of the United States Supreme Court. The judge ruled that her family was full of imbeciles, and the government had every right to stop her from passing on her genes. That decision didn't appear out of thin air. By the early 1900s, a movement called eugenics had already convinced a lot of wealthy elites, scientists, and politicians that society worked like some kind of breeding experiment. They believed you could improve the country by controlling who was allowed to have children. The idea got even more popular when politicians figured out the financial angle. If poor people had fewer kids, the government could spend less money supporting them later. The top guns were fired up and ready to go, but they knew that turning the idea into policy meant stepping into dangerous legal territory. The second people started losing the right to have kids against their will, a lawsuit was basically guaranteed. So they picked a case designed to settle it in court once and for all. Carrie Buck became that cause. Carrie was actually a perfectly normal student with average grades. Her life only fell apart after a relative assaulted her and she got pregnant. To cover up the family scandal, her foster parents had her committed to a state hospital and told the doctors she was mentally unfit. State officials knew she was completely fine, but they rigged her trial anyway. They assigned her a defense lawyer who was secretly working for the other side, so the man barely put up a fight. The court ruled against Carrie, and she was forced into surgery. That ruling blew the doors wide open. When the Depression hit and states started scrambling to cut welfare budgets, 32 of them jumped on the eugenics laws. North Carolina made the process so easy that you didn't even need a real doctor's opinion to force surgery on someone. A regular social worker could sign off on ending an entire family's bloodline over their lunch break, just because that family was collecting welfare. The program got so aggressive that it caught the attention of a guy overseas with a terrible mustache. In his book, Adolf specifically praised the United States for passing these sterilization laws. Less than 6 months after taking power in 1933, the Nazi government copied the American model, passed their own version, and ended up sterilizing 400,000 people. Americans only lost their appetite for eugenics after the horrors of the final solution to the Jewish question came to light in 1945. Suddenly, breeding a master race didn't sound so scientific anymore. To this day, the Supreme Court has never actually overturned the ruling in Carrie Buck's case. Carrie herself survived, worked quietly as a housekeeper for decades, and lived a dignified life until she passed away in 1983. The Lobotomy Boom. It's September 1936 inside an operating room in Washington. A 63-year-old housewife named Alice Hammett is lying on the table while a surgeon drills 2 holes straight into her skull, reaches in, and slices the nerve fibers connecting the front of her brain to everything else. When Alice wakes up, her personality is gone. She just stares blankly at the wall. But since she wasn't complaining anymore, her doctor marked the whole thing down as a massive success. That was the first lobotomy ever performed in the United States. And over the next 20 years, doctors did the exact same thing to tens of thousands of Americans. The roots of it go back to the Depression. When the economy collapsed, the stress pushed people to the edge. Families who couldn't cope with mentally ill relatives started sending them to state hospitals, and those hospitals filled up fast. Doctors had almost nothing that actually worked, so they started looking for shortcuts. In 1935, a Portuguese doctor named Egas Moniz heard about experiments where cutting connections in a chimpanzee's brain made it calmer, and figured, why not try it on people? He drilled into patients' skulls, severed parts of their frontal lobe, and called it a breakthrough. An American doctor named Walter Freeman read about Moniz's work and got obsessed. He saw lobotomies as a way to clear out the overcrowded hospitals. But there was just one problem. He wasn't a licensed surgeon, so he couldn't legally cut anyone open. His workaround was teaming up with an actual surgeon who handled the drilling while Freeman stood over his shoulder directing everything. Their first patient together was Alice Hammett. The people Freeman went after usually weren't violent or even seriously ill. They were just inconvenient. Over 60% of lobotomy patients nationwide were women, and a lot of them ended up on that table because a husband or a father decided they were too difficult to deal with. His most famous victim was Rosemary Kennedy, the 23-year-old sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Rosemary had some mild developmental delays, but she lived a full life. She went to parties, wrote letters, and functioned on her own. Her father decided she was too hard to manage, so in 1941, he secretly hired Freeman to lobotomize her. The surgery destroyed her brain completely. She woke up unable to speak and spent the next 60 years hidden in an institution with the mental capacity of a toddler. Even after that, Freeman thought the drilling method was too slow. So in 1946, he came up with a faster version using an ice pick. He'd slide it above the patient's eye, tap it through the thin bone with a mallet, and wiggle it side to side to cut the brain tissue. He got so confident with this technique that he bought a camper van, turned the whole thing into a traveling show, and drove from hospital to hospital across the country, performing hundreds of procedures on the road. The only thing that finally put Freeman out of business was a pill. In the 1950s, drugs like Thorazine made it possible to calm patients without cracking their skulls open. Hospitals started emptying out. The demand for lobotomies dried up, and Freeman's traveling horror show quietly rolled to a stop. The Rise of Adolf. It's January 30th, 1933, and it's freezing in Berlin. You're standing on the street watching thousands of people march past with flaming torches, cheering like they've just won a war. In a way, they think they have. Adolf has just been sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. Up on a balcony, a group of powerful politicians are watching the parade and smiling. One of them, a man named Franz von Papen, joked that they'd hired Adolf and could control him, said they could fire him anytime they wanted. That prediction aged about as well as you'd expect. These men didn't hand Adolf the job because they liked him. They did it because Germany was falling apart and they were running out of options. After World War I, the country got buried under crushing war debts, and the economy spiraled so badly that by 1923, prices had gone so insane that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Great workout for the arms, but terrible for staying alive. Then the Depression made everything worse. Germany had been surviving on borrowed American money through arrangements called the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. When the U.S. economy collapsed and that money vanished, Germany went down with it. By 1932, millions were out of work, families were starving, and the government couldn't agree on how to fix any of it. Adolf watched all of this and saw this coming. He plastered the country with simple, angry posters showing crowds of tired, hollow faced Germans staring forward with dead eyes. At the top, he added the words, "Our last hope," and then signed his name underneath. This message worked wonders for starving workers. They were getting desperate, and many were starting to look toward communism. The idea that the working class could and should take power from the rich people. That shift terrified wealthy business owners. So instead of risking a workers' takeover, many of them backed Adolf as a strongman who would protect their interests. They funded his campaign, and he used that money to build up his street forces and crush anyone who pushed back. Once he had the top job, he just needed an excuse to tear up what was left of the rules. He got one 4 weeks later, when the German parliament building conveniently caught fire. Adolf immediately called it a sign from God, blamed the communists, and used the panic to convince the 85-year-old president, Paul von Hindenburg, to sign away the country's basic rights. Free speech, privacy, all of it was gone overnight. A few weeks after that, in March 1933, he pushed through one final law that gave his cabinet the power to make any rule it wanted without asking anyone. By July, every other political party in Germany was banned, and his rivals were already being shipped off to the first concentration camps, which had opened at Dachau back in March. If you're wondering why this is coming up in a Great Depression iceberg, here's why. None of Adolf's tactics would have worked when life was normal. Back in 1928, when the economy was stable, his party only got 2.6% of the vote. Nobody cared. It was only after the banks collapsed and bread started feeling like a luxury that people got desperate enough to listen. That's the end of today's iceberg. And apologies again for the voice quality. I'm still battling a cold. If you enjoyed the dark side of world history, don't forget to like and subscribe.